Thanks so much. So great pleasure to be here. I hope I won't bore you today with a big rant about what is not functioning well with the DSA. In general, I'm a huge DSA fan. I will probably tell you much about it, but sometimes it also makes sense to have a proper look on what could be better in the world, also with the DSA. So as we said already, the talk is called The Numbers Don't Add Up, so that might be a spoiler effect for you already. The paper is called From Reports to Reality. You can find the paper in the QR code that you can see here. Thanks and big shout out to Ben Wagner and Hansa Brown, who were in my supervising committee, also for my PhD. And yeah, let's give it a go. For everyone who's not yet introduced to the beautiful Digital Services Act, it is a relatively new digital regulatory framework of the digital decade, so the broader landscape of EU regulation that we have now basically gotten to know. Maybe some of you know the General Data Protection Regulation. Some of you might have heard about the AI Act or the Digital Markets Act. But the Digital Services Act is also one of the big ones that we have now, and it's making new rules for very large online platforms like Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, or search engines, but also for smaller platforms like Roblox, for example. And it gives a palette of new reporting mechanisms, new obligations that you have to fulfill, think about. It doesn't really tell you how you should do content moderation, but content moderation, of course, is a core topic for all of those platforms. So we don't want to have a lot of illegal content there, for example, but they don't tell you how to do it, but how you should prove your processes are in order. Okay, in general, sounds all good. We get more transparency. We get a lot of cool accounting mechanisms in, but the problem very often is that transparency alone is not solving everything in our world. Also, we need something to really prove, okay, those platforms are doing a good job, they are accountable, we have evidence if we also follow up with the fines, because the fines are also a big issue when you have one of these big new regulatory frameworks like the Digital Services Act. You can have fines that are up to 6% of the annual global turnover of the platform. So that is going to be an expensive one. DSA architecture. So what are the core things that in this paper we at least focus upon? So there, as I said, it's a huge framework, but we took the core transparency reporting mechanisms out. So one are the transparency reports. The second is the statement of reason database. The third, the systemic risk assessment, and the fourth, the independent audits. For everyone who did not hear about those mechanisms, a short overview. Transparency reports you might have known from different regulations or also from voluntary endeavors that platforms were thinking, okay, we show you what we do in a year, basically, on content moderation with our platforms, how we try to keep our platforms safe. So in the Digital Services Act, you have two forms of transparency mechanism obligations. For the very large online platforms, so the Instagrams and the Facebooks. So basically, if you fulfill the criteria of Article 33 under the DSA, then you have to do that twice a year. So every 6 months, you have to issue a transparency report. A transparency report gives you a bird's eye view on what did you do content moderation wise, how many content moderators do you employ, for example, how much did you delete, which categories did you delete, how much did you remove, etc., etc. So that is something that you, as Instagram, report twice a year. Statement of reason database is something that feels very different. That is something that you log every content moderation decision that you do kind of instantly. So you have a very different data source that you can look at. In general, that is also the key idea behind of this paper. This should add up. So if you look at the statement of reason database, this should very much be in line, of course, with the transparency reports. The systemic risk assessment reports are also a very interesting new reporting mechanism. Systemic risk assessment reports are also only for the very large online platforms and very large search engines. You have 4 risk categories that are systemic risks. First risk category, illegal content. Second risk category, everything that is against fundamental rights, so negative effects on fundamental rights like freedom of expression, privacy, something like that. Third risk category is negative effects on the electoral process and civic discourse. So, for example, disinformation and election things. Fourth risk category, a little bit more spongy. So everything that might be gender-based violence, everything that might be reflecting rights of the child, everything that might be negative effects on the physical and mental well-being. Everything that has to do with those 4 categories, platforms themselves have to identify, analyze, and assess. Report every year, once in a very long report themselves, and show for each of those risk categories, for each of the subsystems that they have, what did they do against those risks. So completely different data source, of course, in comparison to the other one before. And then the 4th category, the independent audit, is looking at an external auditor is assessing the systemic risk assessment reports that the platforms did do themselves. So then they are looking, did the platforms do a good job in their self-assessment to identify, analyze, and assess those systemic risk categories? And then they basically give them grades like, you did well, you completely failed the category. That is an overview of the things that we used as data sources in order to see if it makes sense. So that is basically the idea. We wanted to have like a holistic picture of compliance. So ideally, this all goes in harmony and everything makes sense and everything helps you to understand a different part of reporting from another data source. So that is the magic idea behind it. 3 research questions. How can different forms of consistency be assessed across DSA reporting instruments? Because like in theory, all of those things should be consistent. So consistency is kind of the essence that we were trying to link all of those data sources, reporting mechanisms, and reporting structures towards too. What challenges and opportunities arise when we check for those things in the case of OneVLab, in our case, Instagram? How can consistency support effective oversight and auditing under the DSA? So how can you use the lens of consistency meaningfully in order to make all of those mechanisms come together in a big harmony? Instagram is a core VLAB. Instagram is, of course, as all of you know, part of Meta, so Instagram and Facebook. They are doing a lot of those compliance work since before already the DSA for everyone who is working around those topics a little bit longer, especially in Germany, since this is a talk basically hosted in Berlin. We had the beautiful Network Enforcement Act. So that was already one of the laws that gave you reporting mechanisms like transparency reports mandatory. And of course, that is also a good example. Like in that case, Facebook was fined because they didn't do a good job on the Network Enforcement Act reporting in the years back. But Instagram also makes a lot of sense to have a look and see if the numbers add up. So as you can see, very large online platforms, they have a lot of average monthly daily active users. We did look at 4 of their transparency reports. If you look at them now, cool future work to see how did it progress. You will have more transparency reports. You will have also more data logged into the statement of reason database. At the point of time, it was 58 million statement of reason entries. And then you also, of course, now have more systemic risk assessment reports and audit reports. We only looked at 1 in our study. So here's basically why we wanted to use consistency in different lenses to have a look at different parts of those reporting mechanisms. So We call it the 3 levels. Paola Lopez is not in the room, but she was also very, very much involved in coining this term. So the 3 levels of consistency, big shout out to her. If you think about it, the first layer that we want to look at is we look at one of those different sources of reporting mechanisms. So in our case, it's very often, for example, a transparency report. And then we just see if it internally makes sense. So, for example, is there good terminology used? Is it even consistent within the descriptions of it? So what can we find out when we only look at one of those? External consistency, on the other hand, is putting together several of those reporting mechanisms. So for example, we use the statement of reason database against the transparency reporting mechanisms. And then the historical consistency is looking at what happened from past to present. And can we see some new patterns emerge if we look at all of those reporting data? Something that is always very important if you look at a paper like that, we look at consistency in reporting. That can have a lot of different reasons behind it. So sometimes it is also the terminology that might be used by a database, like the statement of reason database, that can give you discrepancies. Sometimes it's something that comes from the platforms, but in general, if you find discrepancies here, we don't necessarily talk about legal infringement. We don't talk already about non-compliance of a platform, because we cannot do that. We can only show we think this looks not ideal. So we think that there are discrepancies that might, if a competent authority is looking at that, provide some traces of evidence, some forms of hints towards something to take a closer look at. But that is something that I always like very careful to coin a term like that. Research design wise, I work a lot interdisciplinary. So in everything, usually I have like a legal hook. Sometimes it's one of my favorite laws, like the Digital Services Act. And then you find something that is just very thrilling to take a closer look into that. And for example, here it was a plethora of reporting mechanisms. So in order to do that, first we have legal doctrinal methods. What does that mean? So first we try to find the legally relevant material even to have a look. So I don't know how many of you in the audience are having a legal background. So for example, in a law, you have a lot of articles, then you have to find the relevant articles. So for transparency reporting, for example, it would be Article 15, 24, and 42. And then, for example, you also need to read the recitals that come next to it. So those are helping you to understand the articles, but they are not mandatory. In that case of the reporting mechanisms, especially in transparency reporting, you also have to look at the delegated regulation. The delegated regulation is a regulation that basically hangs under the Digital Services Act under specific articles. So it gives you even more concrete detail of how those reporting mechanisms should be structured and how they should look like. One of the things that you will see for everyone who is super up to date with transparency reporting nowadays, the delegated regulation kicked in, I think, on the 2nd of August 2025. So when we were writing the paper, the delegated regulation was not mandatory to implement yet. So that also shout out for future work. This would be something that would be super interesting to look at now that the delegated regulation is mandatory, and you really have to follow that structured approach that the delegated regulation is giving you. The delegated regulation, for example, gives you templates on how transparency reports should look like. So before that was, of course, way more messy. Now, when you have templates, this is looking differently. That is why legal doctrinal methodology is important here. As I said, we were using 4 rounds of transparency reports from Instagram in that case. we were using the statement of reason database. Also, something that is important to consider, we used the second transparency report of Instagram because the first transparency report of Instagram would have not covered the full time that the statement of reason database was functioning, because that only came in on the 23rd of September 2023. And then first systemic risk assessment report and first independent audit report. So that is what we used for the methodology. Yeah, the reports do not consistently add up with themselves, one another, or time. Let's have a closer look at that. First, internal consistency. I don't know if any of you in that audience are watching reality TV. This talk will have a meme consistency running through it in 3 levels. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't have to, because the transparency reporting also often doesn't make sense. When I talk about internal consistency, one of the things that in the beginning, when you look at those transparency reports, you try to make sense of the numbers. And sometimes you just look at a long table and then you see something that has a wording that is merging a lot of definitions. So something like total including other violations, but you have nowhere one of the explanations that tell you what other violations are, because I want to see a total that gives me a total, but not a total that already merges a subcategory in my total number. So that is, for example, something that confuses a lot of the things when you look at consistent reporting. So something that I also wanted to state here again, so delegated regulation was not yet in place yet. And that is something that, of course, the delegated regulation then already also takes into consideration. So it mandates that totals must represent the sum of disaggregated categories, and double counting should be omitted. So something like a category that is called total including other violations should not be done. So something that I was already very happy when I saw that that is in the delegated regulation. Great job. Internal consistency on other layers, things that do not add up, and it is maybe a little bit a broader topic because it's illegal content reporting. It's mandated in Article 16 Digital Services Act. This picture that you can see on the left is for Facebook. However, the reporting process for Instagram looks similar. And this is how the illegal content reporting process looks in comparison to, you also can report under the terms and conditions. This looks very differently. There you have 13 reasons, but for illegal content, you have 4 reasons. I hope you can see my mouse. Otherwise, everything that you have here, this very long line of reporting, is the so-called category other illegal content. Other illegal content, as you can see, needs a lot of more clicks from every user than the other categories. So one of them, I think this is intellectual property, IP. This is, I think, everything that goes against GDPR. One is against defamation, and that is other content reporting. I don't know how familiar you are with your national view on illegal content categories. However, if you think about illegal content, it might be something like child sexual abuse material, it might be terrorist content, it might be selling of drugs. So a lot of categories in that case would fall under the category other illegal content. But this doesn't give me a lot of data that I can then understand where even are my systemic risks, to then trace it back also from the systemic risk assessment, because there I have my 4 categories that specifically say I have to analyze, identify, and assess illegal content dissemination. So the batching basically of that is something that is not ideal. And this is also something that you can see that ideally you have more obligations that provide more granular reporting. And something that the Article 16 already mentions, so in the DSA itself, but also like we cannot really understand how flagging works if the flagging mechanism design like that is super unclear. So this is problematic. External consistency. So let's look at two different forms of transparency reporting. Again, transparency reports, statement of reason, systemic risk assessment, and independent audits. For example, account termination figures, so something like deplatforming, for example, diverge across reporting mechanisms. If you, for example, look at the bold row here, so in the transparency report number 3, you have in the transparency report anything that you can identify under account termination, a very different number, so something that diverges, for example, by 30% for the data that you could extract from the statement of reason database. As I said, this is also like take it with a grain of salt, because sometimes this can also be something that has to do with terminology or something that is not completely linked. However, it is something that we can already use to take a closer look into, do we find other discrepancies here? And also, ideally, if you have discrepancies like that, if I can go a little bit to the end of the talk, so things that I would wish for, give us an explanation in your transparency report. Why are you doing that? Why is that not adding up? So that is sometimes a problem with data integration. As I said, the reporting mechanisms not necessarily always add up. However, something that we need to discuss also as a research community, because if you're finding platforms for exactly having discrepancies like that, we need to understand better from the platform side. We also have to have better standardization measures, and we also need to understand what are we even getting in from our data and reporting pipelines. Basically, something that is also acknowledged in the systemic risk assessment report. So Instagram says reporting systems are not always fully aligned across their internal metrics and DSA templates, which, yes, okay, we understand that sometimes there are problems also for everyone who is super into the nitty-gritty details. In the statement of reason database, there's one reason why you can not report entries, basically content moderation decisions, in the database, and that is Article 17, paragraph 2. So that might be something that goes in the direction of spam. So that is something that maybe if it's super automated or if it's just bulky data that messes up your reporting so that afterwards you cannot make sense of that anymore, then you can omit it. However, in general, this alignment is super crucial in order for us to assess compliance, of course. So yes, acknowledging that the platforms did not do a good job is good to see. However, we need better explanations from platforms in order to understand why they are doing those reportings in the way that they do it. That is also something that we can see in the E&Y report, the independent audit report, according to Article 37. So that is something where you have like the flagged Instagram's asynchronous logging system. It does not yet have fully standardized process for reconciliating discrepancies across the transparency reports and the statement of reason entries. So something that they were also seeing that this is a problem. Good that they state that that is a problem. However, we also have to really align it for the future, because that is exactly where we want to go with a regulation that is not super young anymore, but something that just has to be going into a direction where we really can add numbers up, where we really can log data in. So that is one of the problems. They see it, but also we as a research community have to discuss it in detail. Inconsistency in the use of terminology and categories. That is something that is pretty complicated, and also something that in general makes our lives hard. If you look at the transparency reports, if you look at the statement of reason database, a lot of the data that you could match is not ideal, because you cannot ideally match it because of the different terminology and categories that are used. So for example, the categories that the statement of reason database uses, it clusters hate speech and illegal content together. Not ideal. So the more granular data, of course, we have, the better research we can do. Also for everyone, big topic, of course, at the Weizenbaum Institute, researcher data access. So the better data we have also from that database, the better research we can do. Statement of reason data entries, account restriction, account termination, service suspension is something that is not matching. The last two were from the transparency reports, the terminology. And I think that is something that we have to also align, bring together in order to then also understand, like, what are we even talking about in the different transparency reporting mechanisms. And also something that the delegated regulation, of course, did already see. Again, future work, ideally, we can then check if this harmonized language approach is really doing a good job, is going in the right direction, and then from there iterate, align, and make it better. Practical implementation at the moment that we were testing, as I said, take it with a grain of salt because delegated regulation was not fully in place. Not great, still messy, not harmonized enough. So this is not good. Ideally, especially for everything that is going into the VLOP ground, so everything that is, of course, bigger reporting, bigger numbers, bigger platforms, bigger audit scope, etc. We need to have more consistency to bring it together, to function, to synchronize it, to make it operable. Technical pipelines is something that also would help our lives in order to make it better. External consistency, something that, no, that is historical consistency, sorry. In that table, you can see transparency reporting, you have total numbers, you have automated numbers there. And here in the last row, you can see the annoying column that I was talking in the first category and the first level of consistency, total including other violations. Not ideal. Something that you, for example, here can see is some of the categories only appear in report number 4, or they disappear in report number 4. So you have some of the names of the categories that you just change. Something that makes our lives also not easier if they change their categories all the time. We also acknowledge in those regards, a lot of the categories that you can see here are aligned with the terms and conditions naming. So that is, of course, something that has contractual freedom for the platform. So they can basically make whatever terms and conditions name they want. However, for us to compare, this is not ideal. And then you can also see, of course, the numbers go up and down. I think the next table is something where you can see it a little bit better. You have fluctuations between the reporting cycles. So sometimes you have some changes in the reporting that are just like peaks where it makes sense to have a closer look. Here are some of the examples that I highlighted for you. So child sexual abuse material and exploitation from year 2 to year 3, or report 2 to 3, you have plus 490% increase. So something that, of course, please explain what happened there. But then also in another report, the automatic content moderation measures were lower, so minus 22%. But then also they report that they have like more or less content moderators employed in their transparency reports, which doesn't add up. Like those are exactly the reasons where we really need to have like aligned reporting, where we really need to understand, okay, you reduce your automatic content moderation team, or you do something less here. Do you then employ more or less content moderators, and like specific languages? Are they trained in exactly that category in order to then also assess the systemic risk of the platform? So that, for example, would be Article 34, paragraph 1, letter D, for example, anything that has to do with children. Something that you also, of course, can see is you have a huge soar in numbers in firearms. So content that is related to that. Something that couldn't be an explanation why that soar is happening was that might have been Gaza conflict. So then you have like a lot of new content that has a lot of those firearms in it. Something that you also might see in this violent and graphical content store, also like from report 1 to report 2. Also, something that you can see, you have very different numbers in notices, something that goes very much up and down, something where you have like, if you look again at the other illegal content category, you have a lot of source in that, but if that is clustered like this, we cannot really make sense what is happening there and what is basically the gist of the risk that we want to assess with the systemic risk assessment report, with the independent audit report, and as ideally directed researchers get the data on it too. So we have a lot of challenges. One, and I think a very important one, especially for academia and academic discourse, is structural and semantic misalignment. So ideally we have like better taxonomies. As I said, the delegated regulation is a good first step in that direction, but also for us to talk about what is adding up, what is not adding up, what would be a better terminology in order to use it, in order to then cluster the categories in a meaningful sense, and then to create evidence for enforcement. And the internal quantitative inconsistencies, so that can be something like the other violations, total other violations. This is something that we really also have to talk about, critique, and make better in order to not have like clustered lump sums, because that is not good for the platforms, not good for research, not good for enforcement. Illegal content categories, so anything that goes in the direction of how the statement of reason database is built, but also how the transparency reporting mechanisms are basically split up. If you want to have a look, this did change, of course. Great effort, Commission, for the delegated regulation on that one. But follow-up work should really look into how can we really understand the illegal content categories, because I think in a systemic risk assessment, this is one of the super important ones, and where we all can agree that we don't want to have illegal content in the internet at all in order to understand what can we do to make it better. Category misalignment, so between the systemic risk categories, but also transparency reports and the statement of reason database. That is something that we have to better merge. That might be going to restrictions, but also, of course, to just the framing of the names. And then that is also the same thing with this statement of reason categories, that ideally is something that we also can better understand through reading the transparency reports, or where also the systemic risk assessment reports are referring back to the transparency reports, because that might be numbers that you can add up very well as an online platform, as a VLOG, and then explain it to us, to the independent auditors, to the researchers, and to the Commission as someone who basically evaluates you on that. Something that maybe might be interesting for some of you, of course, we very often talk about user-generated content. A lot of the problems we also have with advertising content. Advertising content is also regulated under another regulation, the regulation on transparency and targeted advertising. So for that piece of content, you might have even additional regulations that you have to fulfill, or data that you have to add next to the content. For example, warning labels, how many people did see the ad, for whom the ad is, how much money was spent on that ad, which is very important if you assess, for example, a systemic risk, negative effects on the electoral process and civic discourse. But something that we cannot read at the moment in the transparency reporting. So something that in my opinion, you also need to report on user-generated content differently and ad content differently. And then also you have to report about what parts of your content moderation is automated. And for that, we see a lot of different measures used. For everyone who knows measurements, this can look very differently. The delegated regulation on independent auditing and systemic risk assessment is saying you need methodologies and you need information on sampling and metrics, etc. However, it would be very good if we have a better understanding and a more alignment in order to then also can compare different platforms. So if I can compare, for example, TikTok and YouTube. And for that, we need better aligned matrices that are reported for how are you measuring how accurate your systems are. And that is also not aligned at the moment. So ideally, standardization in many of those topics is a solution that can get us to the next best iteration of the Digital Services Act. The Digital Services Act is also a regulation that is going to be evaluated next year. So maybe now is a good part where we can have a discussion like that in order to then also propose changes in a direction that goes into standardization of some of those matrices, some of those measurements, some of those categories, and some of those terminologies. So basically, cross-referencing, statement of reason database, systemic risk assessment, transparency reporting, have all consistency, how we can course is very important. So more information about how we really can understand from the people who are going in, for example, for the independent audits, what kind of interviews did they take? Did they assess the reporting mechanisms? Did they click through all of the categories? How often did they do that? In which time frame did they do that? And that can also be helpful, especially if you look at in the historical comparison, where you see that some of the categories just disappear. So the spam category, for example, is not there in the first year, but might be there in the second year. So for exactly those things, we also need data on it. And then more holistic compliance approaches is, I think, something that we really can wish for, because that is the thing that then makes the best way of evidencing that we can have. And if we are asking for a lot of high fines, this is also where the discussion should be going, in my opinion. So transparency becomes meaningful when everything is going into a very harmonic way, if everything is going to be in balance, and if all of those reporting mechanisms are used together, because then we can make the best sense of it. And yeah, this is it from my side. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you so much for listening to me and for my wishes and my rants about what is going right and wrong.